She was just a child, kneeling in the snow beside her mother's grave when she whispered 4 impossible words. Mom is still alive. No one believed her. No one except a single father passing by, and a millionaire who quietly decided to dig deeper. This is not just a story about loss. It's about the miracle that followed. If stories like this speak to your heart, consider subscribing. It's the best way to make sure you never miss the moments that matter most. Now let me tell you what really happened. The afternoon light filtered gently through the amber canopy of the old maple tree, its leaves fluttering in the crisp autumn breeze like 1,000 whispered memories. Beneath it, in the quiet cemetery of Briar Ridge, Callan Ridgway knelt with one arm around each of his twin daughters. His denim jacket was dusted with sawdust from the morning's carpentry work, and the scent of pine still clung faintly to him. Delaney, always the more thoughtful of the 2 girls, traced her fingers over the smooth granite headstone. Her lips trembled as she whispered something too soft for even the wind to carry. Callan leaned in. "What was that, sweetheart?" Delaney blinked up at him, her eyes unusually glassy. "She's not gone, Daddy," she said. "I can feel her. She's still here." Beside her, Briar tilted her head with a puzzled look, like ghost stuff. Delaney shook her head. "No, not like that. I just know." Callan didn't respond immediately. He looked down at the engraved name Sable Marin Ridgway and let out a breath that steamed in the cooling air. It had been 6 years since the forest fire, 6 years since they buried a woman whose body had never truly been identified, just a charred remnant found near the ridge trail with her wedding ring and a scorched fabric scrap embroidered with an S. He hadn't questioned it. Not really. He couldn't afford to. 2 infant girls needed diapers and bottles and lullabies, and grief had to take a back seat to survival. But Delaney's voice, that strange certainty, planted something in him that refused to be ignored. "We should go," he said softly, standing and brushing the leaves from his jeans. The wind's picking up. The girls took his hands, and together they walked the winding path back toward the truck. As they passed a figure seated on a weather-worn bench, Callan offered a nod. The woman, wrapped in a long gray wool coat, didn't speak. Her silver hair was tied back in a low twist, and her eyes were fixed on the distant hills. She seemed familiar, though Callan couldn't place her. Something about her made him slow his step, but Delaney tugged his hand, and the moment passed. That woman was Iris Veller, and she hadn't been back to Briar Ridge in over 20 years. That night, as the girls played with their paper dolls by the fireplace, Callan stared at an old photo of Sable. Her laughter had once filled the halls of this home like light. She had fiercely loved the smell of lavender, the sound of rain on a tin roof, and making cherry cobbler every Thursday afternoon. He remembered the cobbler, always with too much cinnamon. He had teased her for it. She had teased him back with a kiss. Delaney came to him with her drawing a sketch of the maple tree and a woman standing beside it. "It's Mommy," she said. She was there today. Callan's heart caught. "Why do you think that I just know?" she said without hesitation. He studied the drawing. The woman's face was only partially formed, like memory still in progress, but the figure stood where the maple's shadow fell, one hand resting on the headstone. There was something tender in the posture, something that made his chest tighten. He placed a hand on Delaney's soft hair. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Across town, in a hotel suite that overlooked the lake, Iris Veller set down her tea, slowly, her fingers trembling. She had seen that little girl Delaney crying at the grave. The sight had stirred something dormant, something buried deep beneath years of controlled silence. That night she couldn't sleep. Instead, she opened a weathered journal. Tucked inside was a faded photo of a baby girl swaddled in a blanket marked with the Ridgway Clinic emblem. The baby had been declared lost in a fire at the hospital's neonatal unit 4 decades ago. Her name had never made it onto a headstone, but in Iris's heart, she had always been Sable. I saw her iris whispered to the photo. I saw her eyes. The following morning, Callan packed lunches, tied shoelaces, and brushed knots from Briar's wild curls. The girls giggled and squabbled over jelly flavors and seat positions, and everything in the Ridgway house seemed as normal as any other Tuesday. But in Callan's chest, something new stirred. A question. A flicker. A need to know. As he buckled Delaney's seatbelt and shut the truck door, his gaze drifted back toward the cemetery. The maple tree shimmered gold under the morning sun, and for the first time in years, he wondered, what if she hadn't died? The next day brought a quiet drizzle that misted the windows of the hotel overlooking Ridge Lake. Iris Veller stood at the glass, her hands clasped behind her back, watching as the autumn fog curled across the water like breath from a sleeping giant. She hadn't meant to stay in town. Her intention had been a brief visit, pay her respects at her late husband's grave walk, the familiar streets of her youth, then disappear before anyone recognized her. But the moment she saw that little girl cry at the grave, something inside her shifted. There had been a stillness in the child's face, a solemnity far beyond her years. Iris had watched from the bench as the girl whispered into the wind. And in that moment, she could have sworn she was looking at someone she had known, or should have known. She returned to her suite and retrieved the envelope she always traveled with its contents, as sacred to her as scripture. Inside was a photo of a newborn wrapped in hospital flannel, a report of the neonatal fire, and a yellowing note from a nurse who had once defied orders to comfort her. The note read, "One infant was unaccounted for. A girl. Records lost in the chaos." Iris traced her finger over the edge of the envelope. For decades, she'd lived with the ambiguity of that fire. A mother without proof, a grief without closure. Everyone told her to let it go. But when you lose a child, the mind plays cruel tricks. Moments of certainty tangled in a fog of impossibility. But yesterday the fog had lifted. That little girl's face, those eyes. She had to know. Across town, Callan was pushing through another day at the workshop. He sanded the edge of a pine cabinet, trying to lose himself in the rhythm of wood and grit. But the memory of Delaney's drawing and her unwavering words gnawed at the back of his mind. She was there today. He remembered how Sable used to walk barefoot through the garden after it rained. She would hum old lullabies she learned from her grandmother, her dress soaked at the hem, and a smile that felt like summer. How did a 7-year-old remember the scent of her mother's shampoo? How did she know to place the figure in the exact spot where Sable used to stand during church picnics? Callan wiped the sawdust from his palms. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was waking up like a story that had been paused mid-sentence and was now demanding to be read aloud again. Iris walked the quiet corridors of Ridgway Historical Library that afternoon. She asked the clerk, a young man with an easy smile, if the town still kept archived property records. When he asked her reason, she replied without blinking, "I'm looking for someone who might never have died." The clerk didn't press. 3 hours later, she found what she was looking for, a list of missing persons from the week of the forest fire. Most had been accounted for, except one. Sable Marin Ridgway, presumed deceased. No DNA confirmation. Personal effects used for ID. Iris inhaled slowly. Her hands trembled as she jotted the information in a notebook she hadn't used in years. Then she closed the book, stood and whispered to herself, "Not again. Not this time." She slid into her gray Buick and drove toward the cemetery. The maple tree stood as it always had, solid, aging golden in the waning light. Iris stepped from her car and walked the path to the grave. She brought no flowers, just the photo. The old one, the baby girl. Kneeling by the stone, she held the photo beside the carved name and whispered, "If it's really you, then somehow you'll know I'm here." Wind stirred through the leaves. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the smell of that baby, the soft weight in her arms for those brief hours. But all she could remember was the sound of alarms, smoke, and a nurse screaming for someone to help. She stayed there until the sun dropped behind the trees. When she returned to the car, she noticed something tucked beneath her windshield wiper. A child's drawing. The paper was damp, crinkled at the corners. It was a new sketch, the same maple tree, a woman in a gray coat, and beside her, a little girl with yellow hair holding her hand. Delaney. Iris stared at the drawing for a long time. Then she sat in the driver's seat and whispered, "I'm listening, little one. I'm listening now." Back at the Ridgeway home, Callan tucked the girls into bed. Briar had insisted on one more story, and Delaney had asked if they could visit the cemetery again next Sunday. Callan had hesitated. "We just went yesterday." "But she might come again," Delaney whispered. Callan knelt beside her bed. "You think Mommy is watching you?" Delaney nodded. "Not just watching. Waiting." Callan smoothed her hair, kissed her forehead, and turned out the light. He stood in the hallway for a long time, staring out the window at the moon rising above the trees. He didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in signs. He believed in responsibility routine and doing the next right thing. But something in his daughter's eyes, in her certainty, made him wonder if belief didn't always need proof. At that same moment, Iris opened her notebook again. She began writing names, Sable's old addresses, hospitals, clinics. One by one, she traced the past with hands more determined than ever. She had lived her life with silence, but now she had a reason to speak. And maybe she had found a second chance at what she had lost. 3 days later, Iris Veller found herself seated at a modest table in the back room of Briar Ridge's courthouse records office. The hum of a ceiling fan spinning above her head, barely masking the creak of old floorboards beneath her boots. A clerk had given her a manila folder marked Forest Fire. Week of May 14th, and with a cautious glance left her alone to read. She adjusted her reading glasses and opened the folder. Charred debris reports, missing persons, autopsy summaries. Some pages were faint from sun exposure, others stained with time. She turned each one slowly, reverently, as if touching someone else's grief. And then she saw it. Sable Marin Ridgeway, presumed deceased. No DNA match due to deterioration. Personal items recovered: wedding ring engraved C2S, fabric scrap linen partial embroidery. Cause of death presumed smoke inhalation and thermal trauma. Iris leaned back. A wedding ring and a piece of cloth. That was all. She frowned. In her purse, she carried something she hadn't looked at in years. A lavender sachet Sable had once stitched as a young teen during a summer class. Iris still remembered it clearly because the girl had embroidered her initials in reverse SM. That was her quirk. She always stitched her initials backward. Iris opened her purse with shaking hands and took out the sachet. Its scent long faded, but the embroidered MS still visible on the edge. A backward signature just like the one listed in the file. It wasn't just a fabric scrap, it was hers, and no one had caught that. That meant whoever identified the body hadn't known Sable well enough to notice the detail. Her breath hitched. What if that wasn't her? She whispered. Across town, Callan stood in the corner of his shed-turned-workshop, holding a flannel shirt that no longer fit him. He meant to toss it, but it stopped him. The hem had been mended years ago, not by machine, but by hand. Sable's hand. She used to sew late into the night by the fire humming under her breath, while the babies slept in their cradle. Every stitch was small, tight, and almost invisible. But Callan had always been able to spot her work. There was always one loop slightly crooked like her own signature. He ran his fingers over that crooked thread. Why now? Why these memories after all this time? Why did the past feel like it was trying to rise back through the floorboards? He looked over to the table where Delaney had left her latest drawing. It showed the same maple tree, but this time the woman's face was clearer. Not complete, but familiar. The kind of familiar that sat just beyond reach. Iris left the courthouse and drove toward the edge of town to a home she hadn't visited in nearly 20 years. It was the address from the fire report, the cabin where Sable and her husband had lived. She expected it to be overgrown, abandoned. Instead, it was alive. A wide porch swept around the front. A bike lay in the yard. A laundry line swayed gently in the breeze. Wind chimes played a melancholy tune. She parked across the street and sat in silence, watching. Callan stepped out with a hammer in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Iris studied his profile. Strong jaw, weathered eyes. He didn't look like someone defeated by grief. He looked like someone who had endured it. She didn't approach. Not yet. But when he glanced toward the road toward her car, something in his posture changed. Not alarm, not recognition. Something wary but quiet. She lowered her gaze and pulled away. That evening, Delaney and Breyer helped their father make dinner spaghetti with too many noodles and not enough sauce the way kids preferred it. Afterward, they begged him for a story, and Callan gave in. "Tell us about the day you met Mommy," Breyer said, swinging her legs from the couch. Callan leaned against the doorframe, a towel slung over his shoulder. It was raining. She was standing outside the bakery, with no umbrella, holding a paper bag over her head, like a fool. Delaney giggled. "Did you offer yours?" He smiled. "Nope." I ran to the car, sat inside, and watched her for a full minute before I realized I couldn't stop staring. So I got back out and shared mine. And she smiled. He nodded. Widest smile I've ever seen. Said I looked like a lost dog. The girls erupted in laughter. But when they'd gone to bed, Callan found himself standing alone by the fireplace, holding the same photo he always kept on the mantel. Sable holding the twins, hair windswept, cheeks flushed. He whispered, "Where are you?" That same night, Iris stood in her hotel room again, lavender sachet in hand. She called an old contact in Denver, a retired detective who once worked arson cases. "I need a favor," she said. Off the record. She explained everything, the fire, the misidentification, the embroidered initials. There was silence on the other end. Then the man said, "You know what you're doing?" "No," she admitted. "But I know I have to try." He gave her the number of a forensic genealogist, someone who could trace more than blood, someone who knew how to find the forgotten. She hung up and looked out at Ridge Lake and whispered, "Sable, if you're alive, I'm coming." That night, as the wind rose, a storm swept through Briar Ridge. Thunder echoed across the valley, shaking the windows. Delaney dreamed of the cemetery again. This time, the woman stepped closer. She reached out a hand, and Delaney, without fear, reached back. Rain fell steadily over Briar Ridge, tapping gently against the windows of Callan's workshop, like a persistent question. He stood at the edge of his workbench, unmoving, staring down at the half-finished cradle he had begun days earlier, a commission for a young couple expecting their first child. The scent of cedar filled the space, comforting and familiar, but today it didn't reach him. He hadn't touched a carving knife in hours. His mind was elsewhere, on crooked stitches on Delaney's drawings, on the photo of Sable with the wind in her hair, on the whisper of a child who claimed her mother wasn't gone. And now he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe she was right. A knock echoed from the front door. Callan wiped his hands on a rag and crossed through the house. He opened the door to find Pastor Boone tall and stooped with his raincoat glistening. "Afternoon," Callan the pastor said. "Mind if I come in for a moment?" Callan nodded and stepped aside. The older man removed his hat and set it on the entryway table, giving the home a warm glance. Still smells like your wife's cinnamon cobbler in here." Callan's lips twitched. "I burn it every now and then just to remember." Boone smiled softly, then grew quiet. "I was visiting the nursing home yesterday. Thought I saw someone that made me think of her." Callan frowned. "Of Sable?" Boone hesitated, only for a second. A woman in the courtyard. The way she moved. The color of her eyes. I can't say it was her. Probably wasn't. But I thought you should know." Callan folded his arms, heart thudding. "You believe in that kind of thing, ghosts know. But I believe in reminders. And sometimes when something needs to be found, it finds a way to whisper." That evening, Callan took the long way home from the market. Instead of turning down Maple Avenue, he kept driving until the gravel beneath his truck crackled beneath the tires. The Briar Ridge Assisted Living Center loomed quietly ahead, gray understated with a small garden that curled around the back. He parked and sat there a long time, engine off, rain tapping the windshield. He wasn't sure why he'd come. Maybe it was the pastor's words. Maybe it was Delaney's insistence. Maybe it was hope, fragile and foolish. He stepped out into the rain. Inside, the receptionist looked up with a practiced smile. "Can I help you? I was just wondering if I could look around the common areas. My wife used to volunteer here. I haven't been back since." She gave a polite nod. "You can sign in. Just the front rooms, please." Callan scrawled his name on the clipboard and stepped inside. The smell of antiseptic and chamomile tea mingled in the air. A television murmured in the lounge. An old man slept beneath a knitted blanket. A woman in a wheelchair stared quietly out the window. He almost turned around. Then he saw her. She was sitting beneath a hanging fern, her back straight, a basket of fabric in her lap. Her hair was longer than he remembered, more silver now, but something about her posture made him freeze. She was stitching. He took a step closer. Her face turned, not fully, just enough to send a jolt through him. He whispered, "Sable." She didn't look up. He took another step. "Sable Marin Ridgway." The woman looked at him, then eyes wide, startled, but not afraid. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Is that who I am?" Iris Veller watched from the hallway. She had arrived an hour earlier, intent on speaking with the home's director about a patient listed under the name Hope. But when she saw Callan's name on the sign-in sheet, something told her to wait. Now standing just out of view, she watched him kneel in front of the woman with silver hair and trembling hands. "I think you're my wife," he said. The woman blinked. "You look familiar." She touched his face as if trying to place it in the constellation of memory. Iris turned away. Her chest tightened. She had found her. She had found her. And now it wasn't her place to step in. But as she turned to go, a soft voice called from behind. "Iris!" She turned. Sable Hope was staring at her. "I know you," Sable said. "You were there when I was young." Callan stood slowly confused. "You know her." Iris stepped forward, her voice gentle. "Yes, I've always known you." Sable's lips trembled. "Were you looking for me?" Tears welled in Iris's eyes. "I never stopped." That night, as the storm rolled out of Briar Ridge, Callan sat beside Sable in the common room. She was still struggling with the timeline. Names, dates. But she remembered how he took his coffee. She remembered the lullaby she used to hum when Delaney couldn't sleep. "I never meant to leave," she said quietly. "I just got lost." He reached for her hand. "We'll bring you home when you're ready." In the corner of the room, Iris watched them with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had stitched together the last seam of a broken quilt. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. Hope had a name again. And somewhere, deep in the heart of Briar Ridge, something beautiful had begun to mend. Sable sat quietly in the passenger seat of Callan's truck. Her hands folded neatly in her lap, the window beside her speckled with light morning drizzle. She had not spoken much since they left the nursing home. Every now and then her fingers traced invisible lines on her jeans, as though searching for something familiar under her skin. Callan gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as the old Ridgway house came into view, their home, though it hadn't felt like anyone's home in years, not fully. He'd kept it functional for the girls, clean, safe, but it had always felt a little hollow, like a place missing its anchor. As the truck turned into the driveway, Sable shifted in her seat. Her eyes scanned the porch, the shutters, the mailbox with the slightly crooked R. Something flickered in her gaze, recognition or dissonance, he couldn't tell. He stepped out and opened her door. "Take your time." She hesitated at the threshold, then set her foot down on the gravel. One step, then another, each one slower than the last. Inside, the girls waited in the living room, clutching a pillow between them. Delaney had insisted on wearing the blue sweater Sable had knit for her before the fire, though it was now a size too small. Callan cleared his throat. "Girls, this is your mom." Sable stood in the doorway like a ghost, afraid of waking the living. Briar blinked up at her. Silent, Delaney rose slowly, her small hand gripping the couch. "You look like my dream," Delaney said. Sable's voice was barely audible. "I've missed you both, even when I didn't know your names." Briar ran to her first, her arms thrown around Sable's waist. Delaney followed slower, but just as sure. Sable fell to her knees, tears slipping silently down her cheeks as she held her daughters for the first time in years. Later, after the girls had gone outside to show Sable the swing set and the garden where they planted beans, Callan brewed 2 cups of tea. He found her standing in the hallway, staring at the blank space above the mantel. "There used to be a mirror here," she said. He nodded. "Took it down after the fire. Couldn't look at myself for a while." Sable lowered her gaze. I understand that." She moved slowly through the house, brushing her fingers along tabletops and picture frames. Everything felt familiar in texture, but foreign in memory. She paused at the doorway of what used to be their bedroom. "Do I have things here?" "Yes," he said. "I kept most of it boxed. Couldn't bring myself to throw them out." She entered. The room smelled like cedar and lavender, though faintly like an echo. Callan retrieved a wooden box from the closet. Inside were her old journals, a stack of postcards she had collected, but never sent, and the necklace she wore on their wedding day, a small bronze locket shaped like a leaf. She held the locket in her hand, staring at it like a relic from a life lived by someone else. "Do I get to remember this?" Callan sat beside her. "You don't have to rush. The memories will come when they're ready. And even if they don't, we'll make new ones." She looked at him. "Why did you wait for me?" He didn't answer at first. Then he said, "Because even if you weren't coming back, I needed to be the kind of man you'd be proud of, just in case you ever did." That night, Sable couldn't sleep. She walked barefoot through the house, her fingers brushing the walls as if each room might whisper something back. When she passed the hallway mirror, one of the few that remained, she paused. Her reflection stared back at her older, thinner eyes marked with time she couldn't account for. She whispered, "Who have you been all this time?" Behind her, a small voice said, "You're still Mom." Delaney stood with a blanket in her arms. "Want to sleep with me?" Sable blinked away tears. "Yes, honey. I'd like that." In the girls' room, she curled beside them on the bed, the blanket a warm cocoon of childhood and forgiveness. They drifted into sleep like petals folding in the dark. The next morning, Iris came by with a small box of pastries and a folder under her arm. "I wanted to give you something," she said to Sable. "And ask you something, too." Sable welcomed her in with a gentle smile. She was wearing one of Callan's old flannel shirts. Sleeves rolled up, hands still damp from washing dishes. Iris placed the folder on the kitchen table. "I've been doing some digging. I think I found the woman who was misidentified as you." Sable's breath caught. She was a transient. No family. Probably wandered into the woods for shelter during the fire. Iris paused. "You survived." She didn't. And they used what little they found. Your ring, your initials to fill in the blanks. Sable opened the folder slowly. A black and white photo. A fingerprint card. A note scribbled by a coroner ID by object match no DNA. Callan stepped in behind her, a hand on her shoulder. "And the other thing?" Sable asked. Iris hesitated. "There's a clinic in Montana, a place that specializes in memory restoration, especially for trauma victims. I know someone there. They helped me once, when I thought I'd lost everything." Sable nodded slowly. "I don't want to lose what I have now, but I do want to remember what I forgot." She turned to Callan. "Would you come with me?" He didn't need to think. "Wherever you go." That afternoon, as the sun poured golden light through the windows, Sable sat at the dining room table with her daughters, teaching them how to sew simple stitches onto scraps of cloth. Her hands moved slowly, but with purpose. Delaney asked Mom, "Why are your letters backward?" Sable looked down and smiled. "Because sometimes it takes a little bit of wrong to make something right." Outside, the swing creaked in the breeze. The garden soaked in light, and inside, a family once broken began thread by thread to stitch itself whole. The Ridgway house was quieter now, but not in the hollow way it had once been. It was the kind of quiet that settled after laughter, after a meal shared, after the soft closing of a bedroom door, where two little girls finally fell asleep beside the mother they'd only known through photographs and bedtime stories. Callan stood by the kitchen sink, watching the dusk wrap itself around the edge of the backyard. The porch light flickered on automatically. He could hear the creak of the swing set empty, now moving lazily with the evening breeze. His hands rested on the countertop, still damp from drying the last dish. In the living room, Sable sat in the armchair, with one of Delaney's drawings in her lap, a new one. The lines were careful, more detailed than before. It showed the family, Sable, Callan, the twins, and an unfamiliar woman with gray hair standing behind them, hands gently resting on the girls' shoulders. "Iris." Sable smiled. "She's become a part of us, hasn't she?" Callan nodded from the doorway. "In more ways than I think she even knows." Sable traced the lines of the drawing with her fingertip. "Delaney said something today that caught me off guard. She asked if I remembered the music box." Callan's brow furrowed. "The one you brought back from your grandmother's house." She nodded. "I didn't remember it, but when she placed it in my hands, I could feel something. Not a memory, exactly, more like warmth, like being home." Callan stepped closer. "Sometimes the body remembers before the mind does." She looked up at him. "Do you think it's really possible that all of it could come back?" "I think," he said gently, "that the parts meant to stay find their way." The next day, Sable sat with the girls in the attic, a room dusty with forgotten boxes and quiet echoes. The twins had insisted on exploring. Treasure hunting, Breyer called it. Delaney pulled out a shoebox full of old photographs. She passed one to her mother. "Do you remember this?" Sable stared at the photo. A young woman herself laughing with a baby in each arm, flour on her nose, a pie crust on the table behind her. "I think I do," she whispered. "At least, I remember how that felt." Delaney smiled. "You always looked happiest in the kitchen." Sable laughed softly. "Well, I was usually making messes. Your father did most of the actual cooking." From another box, Breyer unearthed a small, worn journal with a cracked leather cover. "This one has your name on it, Mommy." Sable opened it. Inside were simple lists, grocery items, craft ideas, tiny recipes scribbled in shorthand. Then on one page, a single line: Delaney likes music. Briar likes clouds. I like being their mother. The words hit her like a wave. She closed her eyes, pressing the book to her chest. I didn't lose everything, she murmured. I just needed a way back to it. Later that afternoon, Callan and Iris sat on the porch, watching the girls play tag in the yard. The late October sun was warm against their faces, and a mason jar of lemonade sweated on the table between them. She's coming back, Callan said. Little by little, Iris sipped her drink. Memory is a strange thing. It doesn't return in straight lines. It dances. He looked at her. What made you keep searching after all those years? Her answer was quiet. Because love leaves traces. And I refused to believe the world was so careless as to erase all of them. Callan nodded slowly. I'm grateful. For what you did. For who you are. Iris gave him a look, both amused and tender. Don't get sentimental on me now, Ridgway. There's still a lot of story left to tell. That evening, Sable tucked the girls into bed for the first time without help. She smoothed their blankets, kissed their foreheads, and whispered the same lullaby that had returned to her 2 nights ago. Where did you learn that again? Briar asked sleepily. Sable thought for a moment. I think I made it up. Or maybe it made me up. When she turned to leave, Delaney sat up. Moya, sweetheart. Do you know about the tree? Sable paused. The maple tree, Delaney nodded. The one in the cemetery. That's where I heard you the first time. Sable came back to the bed, sitting gently at its edge. What did you hear? A whisper. Not words. Just you. It felt like you were trying to come home. Sable swallowed hard. Maybe I was. Delaney reached under her pillow and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. I drew this after that day. It was the maple tree, the grave, and a small figure standing just beside it, drawn with bright yellow lines. Above it, a faint sun broke through gray clouds. Sable took the paper gently. Can I keep this? Delaney smiled. It's already yours. That night, after the girls had gone quiet, Sable and Callan stood together in the hallway outside their room. She held the drawing in one hand, the other curled into his. I'm afraid of going to Montana, she admitted, afraid that remembering might hurt more than forgetting. He looked at her steady and sure. Then we face it together. She rested her head against his shoulder. I don't know what I did to deserve you. He smiled. You once told me love isn't earned. It's recognized. Maybe that's what we're doing now, recognizing it again. Down the hall, wind brushed against the windows, soft and steady. Sable felt no fear. Not anymore. Because love had whispered through the storm. And this time she had answered. The road to Montana stretched out in a long, quiet ribbon beneath the sky. Wide fields rolled past on either side, painted gold and amber by the late autumn sun. In the back seat of the truck, Briar and Delaney leaned against each other, coloring in a shared sketchbook. Up front, Sable rested her hand gently atop Callan's as he drove her fingers curling slightly with the rhythm of the road. They had left Briar Ridge that morning just after sunrise. Iris had packed a thermos of tea and a small envelope containing directions, a letter of introduction, and a note for Sable that simply read, You're braver than you know. Love finds the pieces we forget. Now, hours later, the journey felt less like an escape and more like a return. This doesn't feel like the end of something, Sable murmured. Callan smiled. Because it's not. It's a stitch between two halves. She looked out the window. I like that. The clinic in Montana was tucked into the foot of a wooded ridge, modern and clean, but wrapped in the kind of warmth that didn't come from design. It came from people. The woman who greeted them, Dr. Marina Keene, had the soft voice of someone who'd spent years helping others find what they'd lost. We don't press, she said, ushering Sable and Callan into a quiet sitting room. We follow. Memory is a stream, we go where it leads. Sable nodded slowly. I'm ready to follow. Callan reached for her hand. And I'll be here when you do. Over the next 3 days, Sable underwent gentle memory reactivation sessions, music photographs, the scent of lavender, the texture of fabrics she used to work with. There were moments when nothing happened, when she would stare at a photo and feel only the frustration of blank space. But then, without warning, there were breakthroughs. On the second day, she heard a recording of an old hymn, the same one Callan had sung to the twins when they were babies. She wept. I sang that in the hospital once, she whispered. To myself. I didn't know why. Another time, the smell of fresh baked apples made her pause mid-step and place a hand over her heart. Cobbler, she murmured. Cherry, with too much cinnamon. Each memory arrived like a stitch, one thread pulling another through. Meanwhile, Callan took the girls hiking near the lodge, letting them collect pine cones and race up gentle hills. At night, they played board games with the staff and wrote postcards to Iris, who promised to keep the swing warm and the garden watered. In the evenings, he would return to Sable's side, sharing quiet tea and unspoken comfort. One night, she turned to him and said, I remember our wedding. He froze, breath caught. The music, your nervous laugh, the way your tie was too tight and I fixed it right before the vows. He blinked rapidly. You really remember. She smiled, like it's something I've been carrying even when I didn't know. They sat in silence after that, the air between them filled with the kind of peace that doesn't need to be explained. On the 4th morning, Sable was asked if she would like to sew something, anything simple. She chose to stitch a square of fabric to a community quilt the clinic kept on display. Patients from all walks of life had added their pieces, fragments of old clothes, pieces of ribbon, names written in shaky embroidery. Sable sat quietly for a long time before beginning. She chose a faded blue fabric and thread the color of sunrise. Her hands were slow, but certain. She didn't use a pattern. When she finished, she handed it to Dr. Keene, who studied it and smiled. It was a small maple tree, under which stood 4 tiny figures, 2 tall, 2 small. One of them held a thread that ran from the tree into the border of the quilt, tying the piece into the next square. This, Dr. Keene said softly, will remind someone else they're not alone. Sable nodded. It reminded me, too. That night, Delaney crawled into bed beside her mother in the guest lodge room. Are you better now? She asked. Sable looked at her daughter's small, serious face. I think I'm healing. And I think that's better than being perfect. Delaney grinned. You can be both. Callan watched them from the doorway, arms folded. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that joy didn't have to be fragile. It could be stitched together, one memory at a time. On their last morning at the clinic, the staff gathered on the lawn to say goodbye. Dr. Keene embraced Sable gently. Not every thread returns to its original weave, she said. But you've made something new, and it's beautiful. Callan loaded the truck while the girls said goodbye to the therapy dog they had befriended. As Sable stepped into the passenger seat, she looked back once more at the building framed in pine and sun. Then she turned to Callan. Take me home, she said. He nodded. Always. And together they began the drive back, not to where things had ended, but to where healing had truly begun. The Ridgway house welcomed them home like an old friend, weathered, but waiting. Ivy had crept a little higher on the porch posts, and the garden beds wore a scrappy autumn coat of brittle leaves and tired stems. But the air smelled the same wood smoke soil, a hint of the lavender that still grew wild near the fence line. Sable stepped out of the truck and closed her eyes. She didn't expect a rush of memory. She no longer chased it. Instead, she let the quiet speak. Delaney and Briar ran ahead, shrieking with delight, when they saw that Iris had hung tiny white paper lanterns along the back porch in welcome. A handwritten note was taped to the door. Home isn't what you remember. It's what you choose to grow next. Ivy. Inside, everything was just as they had left it. The kettle rested on the stove, the quilt lay folded at the foot of the couch. But something had changed. Sable could feel it, not in the objects, but in the way her hands felt steadier when she reached for them. Later that evening, after the girls were asleep, Sable and Callan sat on the porch, swing mugs in hand. The stars blinked gently above the treetops. "I used to dream about this porch," she said. He looked at her. Did it look the same? Yes and no. In the dream, it was always spring. And there were more flowers. He nudged her gently. "Then we'll plant more." The next morning, Sable stood barefoot in the garden, with pruning shears in hand. The sun warmed her shoulders as she knelt beside the withered lavender stalks. She worked quietly, reverently, trimming back the tired plants, whispering thank yous for what had bloomed before. Callan joined her mid-morning, kneeling beside the empty planter boxes. "We didn't plant anything last year," he admitted. Felt like it didn't matter. Sable met his eyes. "Then let's make it matter now." Together, they tilled the soil. Delaney and Briar soon joined, scattering wildflower seeds like confetti, giggling as dirt smudged their cheeks. Sable showed them how to dig small rows for green beans, how to press the seeds gently into the earth and cover them like tucking in a blanket. As they worked, Iris arrived carrying a basket of seedlings and an old trowel. "Didn't think I'd miss digging in the dirt," she said. But turns out, healing looks a lot like gardening. They made room for her without question. That afternoon, laughter filled the yard, dirty hands and muddy knees. Iris taught the girls how to spot worm trails. Callan built a trellis for climbing peas. And Sable? Sable felt roots growing inside her again, not just in memory, but in purpose. That evening, Callan found her in the attic, sitting cross-legged beside a trunk she hadn't opened since her return. Inside were scraps of fabric, old patterns, photos, and a mason jar filled with buttons in all colors and shapes. "I used to tell myself I'd finish a quilt one day," she said, "but I never started." He leaned against the doorway. "Why not?" She smiled sadly. "I think I was afraid that if I sewed it, it would mean the story was finished." Colin stepped inside, picked up one of the fabrics, soft cotton with faded blue roses. "What if it means the story keeps going?" Sable looked down at the fabric in her lap. "Then I think I'm ready to begin." By the end of the week, the house had transformed. Not in appearance, but in spirit. Meals were louder. Mornings were earlier. The garden bloomed in patches. Music returned to the kitchen. On Saturday, they hosted a small gathering. Just Iris, Pastor Boone, and a couple of neighbors. Callan grilled on the back deck, while Sable set out pitchers of lemonade and slices of cherry cobbler, heavy on the cinnamon. Delaney and Briar performed a skit they had written, introducing their family new and improved. The audience laughed, wiped their eyes, clapped hard. Sable stood off to the side, watching the people she loved in the place they all helped heal. When Iris joined her plate in hand, she said quietly, "This doesn't feel borrowed anymore. It feels earned." Iris smiled. "It was never borrowed. You just had to remember it was yours." That night, as they cleaned up, Callan found Sable tacking the first stitched square of her quilt to a wooden frame. "It's the maple tree," she explained. "I'm sewing it first because it's where everything changed." He knelt beside her, where it began again. She nodded. The garden, the attic, the girls, the quilt. It's all part of the same thing. I thought I was broken, but I was just waiting to be sewn back together. He kissed her temple. You were never broken. You were just still becoming. She placed her hand over his. So were you. They sat like that for a long while, surrounded by fabric memory and the quiet thrum of a home rediscovering itself. Outside, beneath the stars, the garden soaked in the moonlight, silent, sacred, and already beginning to bloom. The days began to find their rhythm again, light spilling gently through the kitchen each morning, laughter echoing through the hallways. The soft scratch of a needle pulling thread in the quiet hours before dinner. Sable sat near the window most mornings, stitching slowly piece by piece the family quilt she had promised herself she would one day finish. Delaney and Briar often joined her with their own squares, simple at first, crooked stars, and hearts sewn in wild colors. Sable never corrected them. Instead, she celebrated every uneven stitch. That heart's perfect, she told Briar one morning, holding up a lopsided patch with bright orange thread. It's crooked, Briar said. Exactly, Sable whispered. So is mine. Iris visited often. She brought lemon bars, wildflower bouquets, and stories that always made the girls giggle. But more than that, she brought a steady presence, like the hush of snow before Christmas, or the way a fire settles low after a long evening. One afternoon, while the girls were drawing in chalk along the porch steps, Iris found Sable in the kitchen staring at a recipe card. I can't remember how I used to make my mother's cornbread, Sable said, her voice heavy. Iris didn't rush to answer. Instead, she opened the pantry, looked around, then handed Sable a jar of honey. Start with what feels familiar. Let the rest come to you. So they baked. The cornbread didn't rise quite right. It was a little too dense, a little too sweet. But when Delaney took her first bite, she beamed. Tastes like fall. And just like that, it became their new recipe. One evening after the girls had gone to bed and the garden shimmered with dew under moonlight, Callan found Sable out on the porch, sipping tea and staring at the sky. You ever think healing would look this ordinary? She asked. He sat beside her. I think it always does. We just don't recognize it until it shows up in dishwater and bedtime stories. She smiled. You always find the right words. I had 6 years to practice. They sat in silence for a moment, wrapped in the kind of comfort that required no explanation. I signed up for a class, Sable said quietly. He turned to her. What kind? Storytelling. At the library. For kids. I want to tell the girls stories. My story. All of it. Even the parts I can't quite remember. He reached for her hand. Then you'll give others a map back to themselves. The next Saturday, the library held its first family story time in months. Sable sat on a patchwork rug surrounded by little ones and their parents. Her voice trembled at first, but as she read it, steadied strong, warm her own. Delaney and Briar sat in the front row, heads tilted, eyes wide. The story she chose wasn't a classic or a fairy tale. It was one she had written, about a girl who got lost in the woods and forgot her name. But with the help of a song, a tree, and 2 little birds, she found her way home again. When she finished, there was a long hush. Then the children clapped, and a woman in the back wiped her eyes. That was beautiful, someone whispered. Sable smiled. It's still being written. Afterward, the librarian pulled Sable aside. Would you consider making this a regular thing? Sable blinked. You mean come back every week if you'd like. The children. They leaned in when you spoke, like they knew your voice already. Later that evening, Sable stood in the attic, pinning a new square onto the quilt. This one was bright yellow, stitched with the outline of an open book and a small maple tree in the corner. It's my library square, she told Callan when he peeked in, to remind me that stories don't end. They grow. He stepped inside and kissed her forehead. And you're helping them grow. That night, It rained a soft, steady rhythm on the roof. In the quiet, Sable sat beside the window writing in a new journal. She didn't write about trauma. She wrote about color. The way Delaney had painted her boots that morning to look like sunflowers. The way Briar had asked if they could build a scarecrow with a smile so the crows feel welcome. The way Callan hummed when he worked, always a note or two off but never off key in her heart. She wrote about Iris, about the way friendship sometimes arrives, not as a knock, but as a hand already reaching. She wrote about lavender cobbler crooked stitches and second chances, and when she finished, she closed the book and whispered, "Thank you." Healing, she realized, didn't come all at once. It came in lemon bars, in chalk dust, in a badly stitched heart no one wanted to fix. And it came most of all in the choice to keep living, even when remembering hurt. Because the truth was, she wasn't putting herself back together. She was building something new, and it was already more beautiful than what came before. It was a Sunday afternoon when they decided to plant the tree. The idea came from Delaney, who had been quietly sketching in the garden while the others cleaned up from lunch. She held up the drawing when they passed, her voice soft but certain. "I think we need something that stays." The drawing was simple, a small apple tree with 4 people around it, hands touching the soil together. Above them, a swirl of words. "Hope grows here." Sable felt her throat tighten as she crouched to study the picture. "What kind of tree is it, sweetheart?" "Not sure," Delaney said. "Just one that doesn't forget us." They found the spot near the back fence where sunlight pooled in the afternoons and the soil still held warmth. Callan dug the hole while the girls took turns watering the roots of the sapling. Iris had brought from her own garden a young apple tree with delicate green leaves and a twist in its trunk that made it look like it had danced its way through life. Sable knelt beside them, smoothing the edges of the earth with her hands. She didn't rush. Her movements were deliberate, reverent. "This feels like something we'll remember forever," Briar said. "We will," Callan answered, pressing the final scoop of soil around the base. When the tree was steady, they stood in a circle around it. The wind lifted a curl of Sable's hair and scattered a few petals from the late bloomers nearby. Delaney reached into her pocket and pulled out a ribbon sun-yellow frayed at the edge. "For the tree," she said, "so it knows we love it." They tied the ribbon loosely around one of the young branches. It fluttered like a flag. Then Iris stepped forward with something wrapped in cloth. She unfolded it to reveal a small heart-shaped stone with a single word etched into it. "Home." "I had this made the day she came back," Iris said, her voice quiet. Sable took it in her hand. The stone was smooth and surprisingly warm. "Would you place it?" Iris asked. Sable nodded, then knelt beside the base of the tree and pressed the stone into the soil. "There," she whispered. "Now it knows where it belongs." That evening, as dusk settled in and the lanterns on the porch blinked to life, Callan found Sable sitting near the tree with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. A cup of tea steamed beside her. She was watching the ribbon shift in the wind, her expression unreadable. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. She smiled. "Always." He sat down beside her, pulling the edge of the blanket over his legs. "You okay?" She took a moment before answering. "I think this is what peace feels like. Not the absence of pain, just the presence of something deeper." He nodded, the roots taking hold. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever wonder if we would have made it, even if the fire hadn't happened?" Callan was quiet for a moment. "Then I think we would have found each other again some way. Some time. You can't unlove someone who never left your heart." She closed her eyes. "I don't want to forget this. Any of it." "You won't," he said. "Not while we're still writing it." Later that night, Briar came tiptoeing down the hallway in socked feet, holding a small jar in her hands. "I want to bury this under the tree," she whispered. Callan crouched beside her. "What is it?" "It's a wish jar. Me and Delaney made it. It's got little notes inside, stuff we hope for." He glanced toward Sable, who stood watching from the doorway, eyes misty. "Let's do it together," she said. They went out beneath the stars, the garden still damp from the evening dew. Delaney joined them halfway, sleepy-eyed but determined. They dug a small hole near the hearthstone and placed the jar gently inside. Sable leaned down and whispered something as the soil was returned. A blessing, maybe. Or a promise. Callan didn't ask. Some things were meant to be carried in silence. In the weeks that followed, the tree became more than a symbol. It became a gathering place. The girls read their stories beneath its shade. Sable hung wind chimes from its lowest branch. Iris brought wildflowers to plant around its base. Callan strung fairy lights that blinked gently in the evening, like stars that had decided to stay a little longer. And every so often, when the breeze was just right, the yellow ribbon danced. Neighbors began to call it the Ridgeway tree, but to the family it was simply ours. One morning, Sable walked into the garden alone and pressed her palm to the tree's growing trunk. I don't remember everything she whispered, but I remember this. She stayed like that for a while, listening, breathing, becoming. The first snow came early that year. It arrived gently like a guest too polite to knock soft flurries drifting down on the Ridgeway roof, layering the swing set in powder, settling between the garden rows now tucked in for the season. By dawn, the world outside their windows had turned to white. Sable stood in the kitchen, wrapped in Callan's old flannel, watching steam rise from the kettle. Behind her, the girls were already pressing their noses to the frosted glass, laughing at their own breath clouds. "Can we build the snowman now?" Briar asked. After breakfast, Callan called from the hallway, pulling on his boots. "Gloves. I'm not digging carrots out of your hands again." Sable smiled quietly, plating up warm cinnamon toast. The air smelled like vanilla and wood smoke home. That afternoon, they built more than one snowman. Delaney created a quiet snow reader with glasses and a scarf. Briar insisted on making a snow dog with stick ears and a jelly bean nose. Sable crafted a mother and daughter pair beside the tree, carefully shaping their joined hands. When she finished, she sat back in the snow and just looked at them for a long time. She didn't need anyone to say what they meant. Callan brought her a thermos of tea. He didn't speak either. He just sat beside her and watched the girls chase each other with handfuls of powder and delight. The tree stood behind them all, ribbon fluttering, even in the still air, the hearthstone half covered now in snow, but still solid. Still there. As Christmas drew near, the Ridgeway house filled with more light than it had in years. Sable hung paper snowflakes with the girls in the windows. Iris helped them string cranberries and popcorn. Neighbors dropped by with cookies and jars of jam. On the night of the first frost, Sable found a tiny envelope tucked beneath her pillow. Inside were 2 notes, written in the twins' handwriting. "Thank you for coming back. We're not scared anymore." Tears slipped down her cheek as she pressed the notes to her chest. Not because they made her sad, but because they told her the ache had made room for something else, something bigger. The week before Christmas, Sable returned to the cemetery. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. She brought no flowers, no offerings, only herself. The maple tree stood bare now, its branches tracing thin lines against the sky. The stone still read her name, and the year the fire had taken her. But she no longer felt claimed by it. She sat on the bench, where Iris once watched, hands folded in her lap, and spoke aloud, not to a grave, but to the space between worlds. "I'm not gone. I was never gone. I just needed time." The wind stirred the dry grass at her feet. When she stood to leave, she placed a second ribbon lavender, this time on the old branch beside the grave, not to mark death, but to honor life. On Christmas morning, the family gathered beneath the tree, theirs, not the pine in the living room. Each brought a small item, something to hang. Briar hung a felt star she'd made herself. Delaney tied on a folded poem. Iris brought a hand-carved dove. Callan placed a tiny tin bell near the base. Sable brought a letter. She didn't read it aloud, just tucked it inside the heart-shaped stone's shallow notch. Callan caught her gaze. What did it say? She smiled softly. Thank you. I forgive you. I forgive myself. I love you. And I'm staying. He nodded. All the right words. The wind picked up again. The ribbon danced. Later that day, as the girls napped by the fire, and Iris read in her armchair, Sable pulled a new square of fabric from her sewing box, deep purple, with soft golden thread. She stitched carefully, slowly, every motion purposeful. It was a circle, a tree, a house, a sky full of stars, and at the center, one word. Still. Not because nothing had changed, but because something lasting had finally taken root. That evening, Delaney asked if she could hang one last thing on the tree. It's not Christmassy, she said, holding a wooden tag strung on twine. What is it? Sable asked. Delaney turned it over. It was carved with the shape of a hand, small and slightly uneven. In the center was a name, Sable. I made it in art class, Delaney said, because I didn't want to forget your name again. Sable pressed the tag to her lips, then whispered, Let's hang it high. They walked out together into the snow. Sable tied the tag to a high branch above the ribbon, where the wind could reach it. There, she said. So even the sky can see it. That night, the snow returned, gentle and glittering like the world was sighing into stillness. Sable sat on the porch, wrapped in the finished quilt, her hand warm in Callan's, both of them silent beneath the starlight. The tree stood tall in the yard, lights glowing around it, ribbon twisting softly in the wind. It no longer felt like a memorial. It felt like a promise. A living, breathing promise that everything lost could become part of something found. I remember, Sable whispered, and in the quiet, as snow kissed the roof and the garden dreamed beneath its blanket, something in the air whispered back, So do we. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know where in the world are you watching from. Drop a comment and let us know. It means more than you think. And if stories like this bring you comfort, hope, or simply remind you of the goodness still left in the world, feel free to subscribe. We've got many more waiting to be told, one gentle miracle at a time. Thank you truly for spending part of your day with this story. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and take care of each other.